The city buzzed with the restless energy of a brewing storm. It wasn't the kind of storm that came with thunder or rain. It was the kind of storm that simmered beneath the surface, building up through years of pain, of silence, of promises, made but never kept. There were two worlds in the city, one where the political elite sat in their skyscrapers, sheltered by their wealth and power, and another where the disenfranchised struggled in the shadows, fighting against a system that had long neglected them. These two worlds barely touched, but the divide between them was painfully obvious. Tasha Montgomery had seen this divide her entire life. She lived in the working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city, where opportunities were scarce, but the fight for justice never stopped. Every day she saw the effects of systemic racism, the boarded-up schools, the shuttered storefronts, the empty promises from politicians who never ventured into her community. But what Tasha had also seen, what had shaped her, was the unwavering fight of her father, a civil rights activist who'd fought for change when it seemed impossible. His voice had never wavered, even when the world tried to drown it out. And now that voice lived in her. Tasha's eyes were sharp and her passion burned bright. She had inherited her father's fire, but she'd also inherited his belief that real change came not just from marching, but from organizing, from bringing people together, from demanding what was rightfully theirs. She wasn't just a voice in the crowd. She was a force. She didn't just speak for the voiceless, she was their voice. She channeled her father's lessons, his commitment to equality, into her work. She saw the struggle of every person who walked through her neighborhood, and it stoked a fire inside of her that refused to be extinguished. Her mission was clear: make sure no one in her city ever felt invisible again. Tasha sat on the worn-out couch in her small living room, the weight of her father's absence heavy in the air. She could still hear his voice, his words that had shaped everything she was today. He had always told her, "You can't run from injustice, Tasha. You have to face it no matter how hard it is. It's a fight, but it's one worth fighting." A child, she had watched him stand tall even when the world seemed to shrink around him. He'd faced down prejudice head-on, with strength, with dignity, and with an unwavering belief that change was possible. But there was a part of Tasha that understood something her father had never fully shared. The fight didn't end when the marches were over, didn't end when a law was passed. It never truly ended. It was an ongoing struggle, one that ebbed and flowed, one that required persistence, courage, and sometimes the willingness to push back against the very systems that had been built, to keep people like her and her community silent. She glanced at the framed photo on the wall, her father standing proud at a civil rights rally, his face set with determination. Tasha often wondered if her father had known how much of his fight would live on in her. She had learned from his example that the fight wasn't just about the big, visible victories. It was about the little steps, the conversations, the moments, when people began to question the status quo. And those moments, she had come to believe, were what would change everything. Mayor Samuel Harris was, by all outward appearances, the embodiment of success. Well-dressed, polished, the kind of politician who spoke in smooth, carefully constructed sentences and appeared to care deeply about the community. But Tasha knew better. Mayor Harris's office, with its sleek furniture and expensive decor, was a far cry from the neglected neighborhoods where black families struggled to make ends meet. The mayor was comfortable in his position, insulated by the wealth and privilege of the elite class he served. His political decisions were made behind closed doors, in rooms that didn't smell of the sweat and struggle of everyday people. He was the face of the system that kept people like Tasha and her family in a perpetual cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement. And when he spoke, it was always with the kind of authority that suggested he knew better than anyone else, even though he rarely ventured outside the walls of his ivory tower. His words had a way of dismissing the very real issues faced by the black community, offering up platitudes instead of solutions. He had never felt the sharp sting of being overlooked, of being told that the opportunities given to others would never be extended to him, but his comfort was about to be shattered. The televised town hall had been running for hours, a steady back and forth between concerned citizens and the mayor. Tasha was in the audience, her jaw tight, her mind focused on the issues she knew were being ignored. The questions came about education, healthcare, policing, and Harris had answered, his responses the same worn-out promises he always gave. Tasha could feel the tension building in the room, the frustration simmering beneath the surface. People were tired of hearing the same answers, tired of hearing soon and we'll look into it. They wanted change now. But then Harris's voice cut through the tension, casual and dismissive. Well, you know, he said, a small chuckle escaping his lips. It's clear that some communities have more ambition than others. The Black community, in particular, has to stop with this victim mentality. You can't just blame the system for every struggle. You have to want more for yourselves. The words hung in the air, and for a moment the room fell silent. Tasha's heart dropped, her fists clenched. Did he really just say that? The insult had been sharp, but the deeper wound was the belief behind it. The idea that the struggles of an entire community were simply a matter of attitude, a reflection of a supposed lack of ambition. Tasha could feel the blood rushing in her ears, the familiar anger bubbling up, anger she had felt so many times before. But now it had a new target. Harris's careless words were more than just a slight. They were a direct attack on the work her father had done, on the work she was doing, on the very community she was fighting for. She rose from her seat, her voice trembling at first but quickly gaining strength. Ambition? She called out, her voice ringing through the hall. You want to talk about ambition? You've never had to fight for every inch of it the way we have. You've never had to claw your way to the top while the system itself holds you down. We're not victims. We're survivors. We're fighters. And it's people like you who keep us in chains thinking your privilege can define our worth. The room shifted. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Harris stood there, his smug expression faltering for the first time that night. He tried to laugh it off, to dismiss her words with a smile, but the tension was already palpable. People were listening, and Tasha had made sure of that. This wasn't just about one comment. It was about the larger system of oppression that allowed people like Harris to speak with such careless arrogance. Tasha's words had landed, and the fight, though far from over, had begun in earnest. The news spread like wildfire, and with it, a surge of anger rippled through the Black community. Mayor Harris's words, careless, thoughtless, hit like a slap in the face, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Social media platforms erupted with posts, memes, hashtags, and videos, each voice more outraged than the last. The local news outlets picked up the story, and before long the whole city was buzzing with fury. Tasha sat in her modest apartment, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She scrolled through her social media feed, her heart sinking with every post she read. This is exactly why we can't make progress. He doesn't get it. He never has. The comments piled up in endless streams, everyone a testament to the pain that had been stirred up by the mayor's words. It was as if Harris had cracked open a door to every past injustice and prejudice, and now there was no going back. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the community's anger settle around her. Her phone buzzed again. It was Jasmine, her younger sister, sending a link to a viral video of a protest happening in the streets. "Are you seeing this?" Jasmine's message read. "This can't stand, Tasha. It's all over the place. People are marching, chanting. They're done being ignored." Tasha's heart clenched. She knew this moment was coming. The mayor's words had been the spark, but there had always been something simmering underneath. She had seen it in the eyes of the people in her neighborhood. Tired, eyes that had long given up on politicians and promises. They had been pushed too far. She had been pushed too far. She stood up, pacing back and forth. She thought of her father, the man who had never backed down from a fight, who had never let anyone dismiss him or his community. Her father had been a man of action. And so, she realized in that moment, so would she be. "Tasha, you can't stay silent." The thought pierced through her like a truth she couldn't ignore. She had to act. The next day, she gathered her thoughts, wrote out a rallying speech, and posted it on every social media platform she could. Within hours, her phone was buzzing with notifications, messages flooding in. People were sharing her post, tagging their friends, spreading the word. At noon, she stood in front of City Hall, the sun beating down on her, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. She hadn't expected this kind of turnout. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs, chanting her name. She could hear the words of her father echoing in her mind. Stand firm. Stand strong. She took the mic, her hand shaking slightly but her voice unwavering. Today, she began, her words slicing through the air. We stand together, not just for ourselves, but for every person who has ever been silenced. The mayor's words aren't just a mistake. They're a symptom of a system that has never cared about us. And we're done letting that system define us. A cheer went up from the crowd, their voices rising like a wave. Tasha could feel the weight of their hope and their pain in that moment. This wasn't just about one man's thoughtless comment. It was about everything that had been built on the backs of their suffering, everything that had been ignored for so long. We are not victims, we are fighters, and if the mayor thinks he can ignore us, then we will make him listen. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy pulsing with a unity that filled the air. Tasha's heart pounded in her chest, the power of her words sinking in. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had been held down, ignored, erased. This was her moment. But with every cheer came a wave of fear. As the rally ended, Tasha felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. The media had already started picking up the story, and soon the entire city would be watching her every move. The pressure mounted, suffocating her as her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, both supportive and hostile. Do you really think this will make a difference? A message from an unknown number read, "You're just a voice in the wind." They'll never listen. Her hands trembled as she read the words. The hate she had expected, the backlash from those who didn't understand, was starting to sink in. She thought of her family, her mother who had raised her alone after her father's passing, the people in her community who were looking to her for change. What if she couldn't do it? What if she wasn't strong enough? The pressure felt suffocating, and the weight of her fear threatened to pull her under. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. What if I fail them? The question gnawed at her, deeper and deeper, until it seemed to drown out everything else. She sat alone in her room later that night, staring at her phone, consumed by the messages and the media coverage. The weight of it all felt unbearable. The cruel words, the threats, the judgment, it all felt like too much. She thought of her father again, of the quiet strength he had always carried, even in his hardest moments. Tasha closed her eyes, leaning back in her chair, trying to steady her breath. The memories of him flooded her mind, his voice ringing clear. You have power, Tasha, never forget that. The weight in her chest lightened just a little. He had been right. She had power, the power to speak, the power to lead, the power to change things. The fear would never fully go away, but it didn't have to control her. She stood up, took a deep breath, and began to write again. This time, not a speech, but a note to herself. You're not alone in this. And even when you feel like you can't breathe, keep going. For them. For you. She sent a message to Jasmine, who had been checking on her all day. I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever. She hit send, and for the first time that day, she felt a quiet confidence wash over her. This was bigger than her fear. This was bigger than the hate. This was a fight worth fighting. The next morning, the city was alive with noise. News outlets, local journalists, and activists had all picked up the story of the protest, and the conversation about Mayor Harris's comments was everywhere. The media had already begun to question his words, and public opinion was starting to turn. It wasn't just about one politician anymore. It was about the system that kept protecting him, and people like him. Tasha could feel the momentum building. The tide was turning, and the calls, for accountability were growing louder, but it wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. She had been invited to a private meeting with local leaders and activists. As they sat around the table, Tasha's mind raced. She could feel the eyes on her, waiting for her to speak, to lead. "Enough of this," Tasha said, her voice stronger than before. "We can't stop at just the mayor's apology. We need real change. We need affordable housing, we need police reform, we need reparations. We've been fighting for scraps, for crumbs. It's time we demand what's ours." The room fell silent for a moment, and then, one by one, people nodded, their faces showing understanding, determination, and something else. Hope. Tasha had just given them a vision for something more than a protest. She had given them a blueprint for change. And it wasn't going to stop until they saw that change through. The room fell silent as Mayor Harris stood at the podium, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He was flanked by his aides, who wore expressions of tension, aware of the gravity of the moment. A sea of reporters and cameras from every outlet filled the space, their eyes locked on him. Harris cleared his throat and began, his voice strained, but the words came quickly. "I stand before you today to offer my sincerest apologies for the comments I made during the town hall last week. I understand that they were hurtful to many, and I deeply regret that. It was never my intention to disrespect anyone or belittle the struggles of the Black community," Harris said, his gaze flicking nervously across the room. I'm committed to learning from this experience and moving forward together as a city." Tasha sat in the crowd, her arms crossed tightly, her fingers digging into her skin. She had watched this entire performance, knowing it was nothing more than a calculated attempt to salvage his political career. There was no heart in his words, no real apology. He spoke like a man who had been caught, not a man who had genuinely realized the harm his words had caused. His eyes didn't even meet the gaze of the people who had suffered under his indifference. He wasn't acknowledging the pain, the real, systemic racism that he perpetuated through policies and rhetoric. This apology was a show, a weak, hollow display meant to calm the public and move past it. Tasha's stomach twisted with disgust. She wasn't the only one. Across the room, she could feel the tension rising, the disbelief, the frustration. She saw it in the faces of the other activists, in the eyes of the elders who had fought their whole lives to be heard. She stood up. Suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her movement sharp and deliberate. The eyes of the room turned to her, the murmurs of surprise rippling through the crowd. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, but she didn't stop. The microphone was still on, and she seized it, her voice rising, cutting through the room like a blade. "That apology isn't enough, Mayor Harris," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But every word was strong, sharp. "It's not enough because it ignores the root of the problem. You stand there, pretending that this is just about one comment about one mistake, but this isn't just about words. It's about a system that has been broken for decades." Harris's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. His apology was supposed to be the end of it. But Tasha wasn't done. "You say you regret the comment, but you don't regret the system you've upheld, the policies you've championed, the privilege you've protected while people in our community suffer." Tasha's words rang through the room, and she could feel the collective breath of the crowd, the tension building with every syllable. "You didn't just offend us with your words, Mayor Harris. You've allowed a system of oppression to thrive, and that's where the real harm lies." She could feel the heat of her words, the anger burning behind every sentence. But it wasn't just anger. It was clarity. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every person who had been silenced, every person who had been ignored, every person who had been told that their pain didn't matter. "You owe us more than an apology. You owe us action. You owe us a reckoning for all the lives you've overlooked. And if you think a few words will make this go away, you're wrong. It won't. Not until you take responsibility for the harm you've caused." The room was silent again. The reporters, the activists, everyone was hanging on her words. Even Harris was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and unease. Tasha stepped back from the microphone, but her eyes never left his. There was no turning back now. She had said what needed to be said, and then, as if on cue, the applause started. It was hesitant at first, but then it grew, a roar of support that filled the room. Tasha didn't smile. She didn't need to. This wasn't about victory. For her, it was about the people. It was about the fight for justice that couldn't be ignored any longer. That moment in the city council meeting quickly became a viral sensation. Clips of Tasha's speech circulated on social media, shared by activists, news outlets, and everyday citizens who were moved by her courage and conviction. The raw emotion, the unflinching truth in her words, resonated far beyond the walls of the city council room. Tasha's name trended on social media as the face of the movement. News outlets that had been lukewarm in their coverage began to pay attention, their reports now questioning Harris's integrity and leadership. His once unshakable support was crumbling, and people who had never spoken out before were now vocal in their demand for accountability. Tasha felt the shift. It was in the way people spoke to her on the street, in the messages flooding her inbox, in the voices of support that grew louder every day. But she also felt the weight of the scrutiny. Every word she spoke, every decision she made was now under a microscope. The pressure weighed heavily on her, but there was no turning back now. She had sparked something bigger than just her fight, something that felt like a collective awakening. And the cracks in Mayor Harris's armor were starting to show. Investigations into Harris's past began to surface, uncovering unethical campaign donations and ties to powerful developers who had been pushing gentrification in the neighborhoods, most affected by poverty and systemic racism. The stories came pouring out, each revelation feeding the public's anger. Harris had tried to present himself as a progressive leader, but the truth was undeniable. The more people dug, the clearer it became that he had been just another puppet for the wealthy elite, willing to turn a blind eye to the suffering of those he was supposed to serve. Harris's political allies began to distance themselves. The support that had once been so strong for him faltered, and his carefully curated public image began to unravel. Even his most loyal followers started to question their faith in him. The walls were crumbling, and there was no stopping the tide of public outrage. It wasn't long before the pressure became too much. In a hastily arranged press conference, Harris stood at the same podium, his face pale and strained. His voice was shaky as he announced his resignation. I resign from my position as mayor," Harris said, his words barely audible. "The city deserves better than me. I take full responsibility for my actions. I failed the people I promised to serve, and for that, I am sorry." It was a hollow resignation, one that would never undo the harm he had done. But in that moment, for the first time, the people of the city had won. Harris was no longer in power, and his resignation marked a powerful victory for the community, a victory they had fought for, tooth and nail. As the news of Harris's resignation spread, Tasha sat alone in her apartment, staring out the window. Her hands were trembling, but it wasn't from fear. It was the exhaustion that came with fighting a battle this long, this hard. Her phone buzzed with notifications, texts, messages, news alerts. But there was something else there too, a sense of peace, mixed with something deeper. We did it, she thought, but the victory felt bittersweet. The fight had been won, but the work was far from over. She had challenged a man, but the system he represented was still intact. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "This fight is bigger than any one man. It's for the future, for the children who will never know the pain we've known." Tasha closed her eyes, a deep breath filling her lungs. This was only the beginning. The movement she had ignited would carry on, a fight for real change that couldn't be stopped, and she would be right there at the forefront of it all. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a small smile, knowing that no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, she wasn't alone in it. She had ignited something powerful, and there was no turning back now. The day after Harris's resignation, the streets were filled with a feeling that could only be described as relief. People walked with their heads a little higher, shoulders not as burdened. Rallies erupted in every corner of the city, but this time, the celebration wasn't one of triumph. It was one of release. For the first time in a long while, the community felt like they could breathe. Tasha stood at the center of one of the largest gatherings, watching as people from every walk of life came together, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and hope. They weren't celebrating the fall of one man. They were celebrating their own power. The victory was theirs, shared, collective, hard-won. A woman, her voice shaking but strong, stepped forward and took the mic. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when someone like him would step down. But I'm here today to say this. This isn't the end. This is just the beginning." The crowd erupted, not in the wild cheer that would come after an election victory, but in a deep unified understanding that change, though long overdue, was now possible. The pain of years of silence, of injustice, now transformed into something else. It was purpose. It was progress. Tasha looked around, her heart swelling. She had fought for this, but it wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's fight. Everyone who had come together. Everyone who had carried the burden of their oppression. And now, finally, their collective effort had been enough to make the system shift, if only slightly. But it was a shift. She stepped aside to let others speak, their voices echoing the same sentiment. The battle wasn't over. The road ahead would be long, and the scars of years of neglect and hate couldn't be erased overnight. But they were ready. The community was ready to keep pushing. Tasha wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, she realized she was no longer just an organizer. She had become something else, a leader, a voice. And though she hadn't asked for this role, she felt it now, its weight, its power. She had never imagined herself in politics. The world of power was a world she had only watched from the outside, where things moved too slowly, and people with good intentions often lost their way. But she had learned something over the past few months. She had learned that power wasn't something you waited for. Power was something you seized, something you used, not for your own gain, but for those who needed it most. As she stood there, watching her neighbors, her friends, her family, all standing together with their heads held high, she made a decision. She had to do this. She had to run for office. She couldn't sit back anymore and wait for someone else to fix what was broken. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "It's not enough to dream of change. You've got to be the one to make it happen." Tasha took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She would face resistance, she would face criticism, but she could no longer stand on the sidelines, not when there was a chance to make real, lasting change. The next morning, she made the calls, first to her closest allies, then to the community leaders who had stood by her side during the protests. She explained her vision, a platform centered on racial equity, education reform, affordable housing, and economic justice. The system was rigged. It was time to dismantle it, piece by piece. "I'm going to need all of you," she said on the phone to one of her mentors, a local activist who had been at the forefront of the protests for years. "But I believe we can do this. I'm not doing this alone." Jasmine, who had been quietly watching her sister's transformation from the sidelines, felt something stirring inside her. At first, she had been unsure of what her role could be in a fight so big, so overwhelming. But Tasha's courage, the way she had fought not just for herself but for everyone in their community, lit a spark in Jasmine that couldn't be ignored. She found herself at a meeting, sitting alongside Tasha, listening as the older woman spoke to a group of young activists about the next steps in the movement. Jasmine had always admired her sister, but now she was beginning to see her in a different light, not just as a sibling, but as a leader. Tasha was changing things, reshaping a world that had never seemed fair to them, and Jasmine wanted in. "I think I want to help," Jasmine said, her voice unsure but resolute. Tasha turned to her, her eyes softening. "You've always helped, Jazz. You just have to find your voice." The older sister leaned in and placed a hand on Jasmine's. There's no one right way to fight. Your way, it'll be yours. But don't sit back, you've got power too. And with those words, something clicked inside Jasmine. The fear she had once carried, fear of not being enough, of not knowing how to make a difference, began to fade. She could see now how much of the work was about community, about standing together. She could see that she didn't need to be like anyone else. She just needed to be herself, to fight the way she knew how. As Jasmine began to step into her own, she looked up to her sister not just as a sibling but as a guide, a mentor. Tasha had paved a path of courage and activism, and now Jasmine was ready to walk it beside her. The city, once divided, now seemed full of possibilities. People were no longer standing on the sidelines, waiting for someone else to make a change. They were asking the tough questions. They were demanding action. And with Tasha at the helm of this movement, the spark she had ignited would grow into something that couldn't be put out. Tasha walked through her neighborhood one afternoon, the streets now alive with conversations of justice and change. People who had once been silent were now speaking up. Their voices, once hushed by fear or indifference, were now a collective roar, demanding that their needs be heard. There was still so much to do. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in her life, Tasha felt something she hadn't felt before: hope, real, lasting hope. She passed a group of children playing in the street, their laughter ringing in the air. She smiled to herself. This was for them, for their future. Tasha knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be setbacks. There would be moments when it seemed like nothing was changing, but she also knew this. They had come so far, and the journey was far from over. It was just beginning. Change doesn't come easily, she thought. But when you stand firm in your truth, when you fight for what's right, there is no force stronger than the power of community. We've only just begun. But I believe in the future. I believe in us. And with that, she kept walking, knowing that no matter what came next, the movement would continue, and the power of unity and resilience would see them through.